Good evening. Good to see you this evening. Take your hymn books and turn to hymn 191. Hymn 191. So I'll stand, we'll sing In My Heart There Rings a Melody. I have a song that Jesus gave me. It was sent from heaven above. There never was a sweeter melody. 'Tis a melody of love. In my heart there rings a melody. There rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. I love the Christ who died on Calvary, for he washed my sins away. He gave within my heart a melody, and I know it's there to stay. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. 'Twill be my endless theme in glory, with the angels I will sing. 'Twill be a song with glorious harmony, when the courts of heaven ring. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. Brother Mike, we open up with a prayer. Man, you may be seated. Hymn 458. Church in the Wildwood, 458. There's a church in the valley by the wildwood, no lovelier spot in the dale. No place is so near to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Oh, come, 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 come to the church in the wildwood. Oh, come to the church in the vale. No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Oh, come to the church in the wildwood, to the trees where the wildflowers bloom, where the parting hill will not Oh, come, 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 come to the church in the wildwood. Oh, come to the church in the vale. No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. How sweet on a clear Sunday morning to listen to the clear ringing bell. It soothes our sweetly calling. Oh, come to the church in the vale. Come to the church in the wildwood. Oh, come to the church in the vale. No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. from the church in the valley by the wildwood, when day fades away into night, I would fain from the spot of my childhood wing my way to the mansions of light. Come to the church in the wildwood, oh, come to the church in the vale. No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale.
It's wonderful to see each of you here this evening. Trust you've had a wonderful afternoon. Please don't forget the events this week. We'll, of course, have our Wednesday service at 7 p.m., and also we'll be looking forward to Saturday visitation, weather permitting, at 9:30 this coming Saturday. Wanted to thank each of you who've been able to help with that so far. We've been able to get quite a few tracts and pamphlets passed out, and we greatly appreciate that. We even had someone here in the service this morning who actually came as a result of that, so praise the Lord for that. Also continue to remember to pray for each of our missionaries, especially our missionaries to Haiti with the unrest that's occurring there in that country. So please continue to pray for their continued ministry, that they'll be able to continue to serve there and to serve safely. Please continue to pray for each other, that God will give us the strength that we need to be able to serve Him better. Pray for each other as we seek to minister in each of our lives, as well as in each of the different ministries of the church. Oh, yes. Karen's has her... Absolutely. So we've been praying for Karen Pollitt for a while. She had this massive surgery 2-3 weeks ago, right? Okay. And of course, very intensive, but we were hoping and praying they actually got all the cancer. So that test to determine whether that is the case or not is tomorrow morning, correct? So be praying for that the doctors have wisdom in determining whether it truly is gone. It'd be wonderful if this was the end of her cancer at the moment, and that God would just be able to give her the strength that she needs to be able to recover from the surgery. So please continue to pray for that, as well as for her comfort regardless of the results.
Hymn 261. 261, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. O soul, are you weary and troubled? No light in the darkness you see. There's light for a look at the Savior, and life more abundant and free. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. Through death into life everlasting, He passed and we follow Him there. Over us sin no more hath dominion, for more than conquerors we are. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. Let's all stand on the last. His word shall not fail you, He promised. Believe Him and all will be well. Then go to a world that is dying, His perfect salvation to tell. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strong. in the light of his glory and grace. Brother Dixon, we ask Lord's blessing upon all.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity. Pray for one to
May be seated. Sister Bethany's going to come and bring the seatings.
We're going to be speaking on the sarcastic rebuttal tonight. Do your friends classify you as a sarcastic person? I think we all probably know what sarcasm is. We'll go over it in just a moment. I can see a few people that you're acknowledging maybe a little bit. I used to be incredibly sarcastic, very sarcastic. And then I started teaching elementary school, and I realized that that skill set didn't really equate to being a good teacher, at least at first grade. So I got rid of most of it, and it never quite came back. What came back ended up being more sardonic than sarcastic, which is another discussion. But I never really came back entirely. But we all understand sarcasm. In our country, we typically find sarcastic humor to be extremely funny. Every culture finds different things to be a little bit funnier and some less funny. But in our culture, we tend to enjoy irony. Sarcasm, as one writer has put it, in its most pure form, however, is a defense mechanism. Maybe you've seen this before. Those who are typically the most sarcastic, there's a reason for some of that sarcasm. It allows the person who deploys it to direct his words at someone else in a manner or form that will be cutting or even bitter. It is a form of expressing anger, disgust, or even disdain that does not directly reveal the offense or the cause of the anger or disgust. It is meant to mock, belittle the person in whom it is directed. Now, of course, we also understand there's irony or just for the sarcastic humor alone as well. But in its purest form, it's usually a defense mechanism. When you feel uncomfortable, but yet your wit allows you to respond with humor instead. Another writer has put it this way: sarcasm usually takes the form of an ironic remark, somewhat rooted in humor, but is intended to mock or satirize something. When a speaker is being sarcastic, they are saying something different than what they actually mean. Let me give you some examples. Zombies eat brains, but don't worry, you're safe. Ugliness can be fixed, but stupidity is forever. You are depriving some village of their idiot. Did somebody write stupid on my forehead? You can tell that these are not necessarily nice comments always. I'm sorry, did the middle of my sentence interrupt the beginning of yours? Ask me if I care. I'm not insulting you, I'm describing you. Aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. I would agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. We understand these comments. There may be a lot of truth in some of them. Usually they're designed to tell some truth in a rather harsh but somewhat softer manner. Maybe you use sarcasm. Maybe you use sarcasm strictly for the wit, simply for the humor and not for the more malignant meaning behind it. Tonight we're going to look at Job's rebuttal. So far we've looked mostly at Job and most of the arguments going against Job rather than his actual statements. We've already looked at 3 of his friends, and they've given their initial statements. Job is going to respond, but he's actually going to respond to all 3 at the same time. He's going to summarize their comments and come back even stronger than before. Now, in this argument he makes a great deal of truth. Most of what he says is absolutely true, with one slight problem at the very end of his argument, and we'll get to that at the conclusion, Lord willing. But he uses sarcasm with his friends, perhaps considering how bad his friends have treated him so far, even to the point of blaming the death of his children on Job's sin that they never bothered to describe. Somehow I think sarcasm is the least Job could do. I think for most of us, we would be so fed up with the friends that we would go much farther than that. But in this sarcastic rebuttal, we also see that Job has a love for his friends that most of us probably wouldn't exhibit. And we'll explain that in just a moment as well. Let's start on the attack that Job levels at his naysayers. And he starts with sarcasm. Starts by breaking it up a little bit with a little bit of levity. He says in verse number 1 of chapter number 12, "And Job answered and said, No doubt, but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you." The idea of ye are the people. You are the ones who know it all, because you truly do. If anyone needs any answers, you are the source of all truth in the world. That's the idea of ye are the people. But he goes on and says, and the truth shall die with you. Meaning that whenever you die, of course, the truth will too, because you're the one that holds it all. Obviously, Job is being extremely sarcastic here. He's getting ready to lambaste all of their arguments in a couple of short verses and get ready to tell them that they're blaspheming God by their arguments, which he is correct. They absolutely are trying to speak for God when God did not tell them to do. And he's going to blame them for this and tell them to watch themselves so that they do not bring the judgment of God upon themselves. But he goes on to verse number 3, and he says, but I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you, yea, who knoweth not such things as these. So Job obviously is a little bit angry here. I think his sarcasm does reveal that he is extremely defensive, and understandably so. He has just had everything in his life taken away. The only thing he has left is his life, and he has repeatedly said that he doesn't want it. He wants to die and end his pain and move on. And what do his friends come and do? They come and mock him. They mock his pain. They mock his God. They mock his relationship with God. His friends give him no peace. One friend simply talks about some mystical experience that they had and somehow equates that to the fact that Job is a sinner. How that he ever did that, I do not know. Another friend is a complete hypocrite in the way he applies his logic. Another friend is equally as caustic as the other two. Definitely not good friends. In this case, Job has a right to be angry if anyone has a right. But he goes on in verse number 4, and now he begins to express his anger in very clear terms so his friends understand it. He says, I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he answereth him. The just upright man is laughed to scorn. He that is ready to slip with his feet is as a lamp, despised in the thought of him that is at ease. Now, these two verses are incredibly loaded with truth. So let's stop just for a moment and explain what he's saying. He starts off in verse number 4, and he says, I am as one mocked of his neighbors. I am an upright man who's laughed to scorn. He's right. God is very clearly saying that Job is upright in everything he's doing, and yet he is being mocked for doing what is right. Doing what is right and getting inferior results according to his friends, and they're making fun of him for it. He goes on in verse number 5, and he says, He that is ready to slip with his feet is as a lamp despised in the thought of him that is at ease. So think about it just for a moment. Have you ever seen someone slip and fall? Maybe not someone you were extremely worried about. Maybe as a younger person, you weren't too worried about them actually hurting themselves. Maybe, I think years ago, they had America's Funniest Videos or something of that nature. All these different people making all sorts of crazy mistakes and what we'd normally be very worried for their health, but instead we play it for laughs. Why? Because some weird part of our human nature thinks it's funny to watch other people fall. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, but it is an unusual trait of human nature that we do think it's funny. Here Job says, you are taking pleasure in my pain. You're taking pleasure in watching me fall. I am as a lamp despised of one that sitteth at ease. The man who's sitting at ease has no need to worry about falling. He's sitting down. He doesn't need a lamp to watch what is in front of him. Job is the one experiencing pain, and everyone who's not experiencing it are the ones who are mocking him. The ones who have something to say with absolutely no experience on the topic. And of course, Job has already said, he says, my logic is not inferior to yours. He says, what makes you right and me wrong? This is something I think we need to be careful as Christians. We all like to think that we have the answers, or that somebody we know has all the answers, but the reality is we're all made of dust, and none of our answers are really worth sharing, really, unless they're based on God's Word. And Job's friends most certainly are not based on God's Word. And so, of course, we've seen his sarcasm and his anger. Now he's going to get down and he's actually going to describe the logical problems that he has with his friends. He's not going to shoot down their arguments. Instead, he's going to attack their very assumptions. The biggest assumption in the book of Job is, of course, that only evil people suffer. And Job is going to obliterate that argument in the next couple of verses. He's going to use the natural order. He's going to use good evidence, I might add. This is excellent logic. And he's going to apply it equally to his three friends. It is very impressive. He doesn't attack just one of their arguments, but all three of their arguments at the same time. But he's going to refer to things that all of us should understand. So he starts with his corrections. He says, of course, his main correction is the fact that sometimes the wicked do indeed prosper. This is a self-evident truth, and he's going to describe it for us. And in order to do this, he invokes the law of the jungle. Do you remember the Jungle Book, the old book that was written years ago, at the turn of the last century? And in the book, of course, the law of the jungle is actually written out for us. It's referred to in the Wolf Pack, if you recall correctly, introduced in Kipling's 1894 work, The Jungle Book, where it describes the behavior of wolves in a pack. We also refer to the fact that we live in a dog-eat-dog world. Or the law of the jungle spelled out by somebody else says, the code of survival in jungle life. Now, usually with reference to the superiority of brute force or self-interest in the struggle for survival. Job is getting very dark here very quickly. So he starts off in verse number 6, and he says, the tabernacles of robbers prosper, and they that provoke God are secure, and to whose hand God bringeth abundantly. He says, if the evil never prosper, and only the evil suffer, how do you explain organized crime? Well, how do you? They had robber barons even back in Job's day. They had politicians back in Job's day too. And they got away with it. This is a self-evident truth. It says, look around. We live in a world that has predation all over the place. The predators win. The more violent you are, the more likely you are to succeed, at least for a while. And he's saying, doesn't nature tell you this? Verse number 7, he says, let's go to the natural world. But ask now the beast, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare it unto thee. Here we have a whole bunch of different illustrations. It's anywhere in the natural kingdom. Look out in your garden and watch the little bugs battle for who gets to eat the tomato first. It is a dog-eat-dog world. Or maybe go out into nature and look out in the sky and watch how many little birds get eaten by hawks or owls. Then watch another bird or owl eat the other one. And it's a great big cycle of life. It says, or go to the ocean and look and see exactly how violent the ocean is. And tell me that suffering is not just a part of life. I've never been a fan of most children's songs. They just don't appeal to me. But whenever I quit teaching for a little while, went to the university, and then I came back to teaching for a short time, in that short period of space, a song was written that had begun to get on my nerves. And I had not had much experience with it because I'd worked with college students. And when I finally came back, I started hearing it in elementary school, and it really annoyed me until I heard the end. And when I heard the end, all of a sudden my faith in society was somewhat restored. Because it gave me the idea that it restores my faith and that nursery rhymes can actually have an element of modern ruthlessness and unsanitized content even for children nowadays. Let me explain it to you. It's a song entitled Baby Shark. Have you heard it? Baby shark, doo-doo-doo, or something like that? And it goes through all those. I'll let you all sing it, all right? Not me. Baby shark, and then it goes to mommy shark, daddy shark, grandma shark, grandpa shark, and by then I'm losing my mind. And then it gets to the part I like. At the very end, it goes, let's go hunt. Okay, that's getting into the cycle of life. I can appreciate that from a philosophical point of view. It goes on, and it says, run away for a whole verse. Oh, well, I like this. That's the idea of hunting and being hunted. This is real life now. It's something that's actually interesting instead of a classic Winnie the Pooh environment where no one ever gets hurt. Then it goes on, safe at last, but it's false safety. And then it concludes by, it's the end, do-do-do. And that's it. And the little fish or the sharks get eaten by some other shark, I would assume. I'm not really sure. But it does restore my faith in the fact that even the modern nursery rhymes have an element of what the old ones used to be about. Maybe you remember some of the old nursery rhymes you learned. And then as an adult, you realize the real meaning behind those nursery rhymes. Maybe you remember playing Ring Around the Rosie. Definitely a dark nursery rhyme, reminding people of the Black Death back in the day. And ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Very disturbing nursery rhyme. But it was given to children so they could have a grasp of the outside world, that the life was harsh. Get used to it. Kind of a rough point of view. Perhaps in a rather harsh environment, it makes a lot of sense. In the Middle Ages, perhaps having your children hardened early had some definite benefits. But this is Job's argument. He says, go to the fish. They eat each other. There's no such thing as a good fish who lives a long life. No, it's the most violent fish that wins. It's the most ruthless dog that gets the bone. That's the mindset that Job is coming at now. And he says, I'm not saying that's a good reason to become ruthless. But let's be honest, even the natural world impacts we as human beings. We are human beings beset by sin. Of course we're going to have troubles and trials and struggles. Job has eloquently destroyed their argument. He's pointed out that robbers exist and thrive, that predators exist and thrive, that everything thrives in a broken world based upon their own violence. He says suffering is native to us all. There's no way to get around it. Now, it is true, we'll see at the end of the message, Job gets a little bit too dark. But he does acknowledge a point that suffering does exist outside of one's own fault. Meaning you can actually do everything right and still suffer. He says life shows you that. That should be a self-evident truth to all human beings. So it's interesting that Job breaks this down for them. But he also goes through and he shows that not only does suffering exist for all, but he also shows that the power of God exists in the midst of suffering. Another excellent point. Job 12:9, who knoweth not in all these things that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this? In whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind. It's interesting here in this case, he's giving a very good reason. He's giving us some very good reason here. He's giving us the idea that God controls or allows all in his creation. Job is his creation, therefore God controls all in Job's life. In other words, God must control even my suffering. He may not understand the purpose, and he gives no defense for why this suffering exists. That's a concept Job does not understand and does not even pretend to understand. I think that's what separates him from his friends. His friends pretended to know the answers. Job knew he didn't know. But he did know the one who knew. He knew that God knows it all, and God knows what's happening. So he elevates, of course, the power of God even in the midst of this harsh world. He goes down to, in verse number 14, down through 8 through 19, he goes through and he talks about how that God controls even the predators, even those in the society that prey upon others, that he breaketh down and cannot be built again. Verse 15, he withholdeth the waters and dry up. He also sends the waters and overturneth the earth. It says in verse number 16, God is the one who has the strength and the wisdom. The deceived and the deceiver are his. 17, he leadeth counselors away spoiled, and judges are made fools. In verse number 18, he looseth the bond of kings, and girdeth their loins with a girdle. Verse 19, he leadeth princes away spoiled, and overthroweth the mighty. It says God has power over even the mighty in this world. He controls all. Even in this violent world in which we live, God will have the last say. Because I don't understand the suffering I'm experiencing. I don't understand why sometimes the evil triumph, but I know in the end, God has it under control. Then, of course, he compares God's great control to the foolishness of men. I think he's taking another jab at his friends here. Verse number 24, he taketh away the heart of the chief of the people of the earth, and causeth them to wander in a wilderness where there is no way. They grope in the dark without light, and he maketh them to stagger like a drunken man. I somehow have a feeling that he might just have been thinking about his friends here. Is as you pretend to have all this knowledge, but you're groping around in the dark like a drunk man. Says you have no idea what's going on, but God does. Says I know your reason, that your so-called spiritual natures, Your spiritual wisdom you're offering is worthless. But I know the God that knows all. So, of course, here he's making this. This is a very personal attack he's making. He's trying to dissuade them from their beliefs. But I also want you to think for a moment. What would you do if you were Job? Would you go through this and actually sit down and break down your friends and how their logic was wrong? How their thinking about God was wrong? Would you warn them would you warn them and rebuke them for their dishonesty, as in Job 13, 1 through 5? He says, Lo, mine eye hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard and understood it. What ye know, the same do I know also. I am not inferior unto you. Surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. But ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Rather a harsh statement, but true. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. Stop and think about why Job is telling his friends this. If my friends treated me like Job's friends treated me, I would tell them to pound sand. I wouldn't be listening to them. You probably wouldn't be either. I would not be arguing with them after the first argument. After that, if you're going to tell me that type of things they told him, we really have nothing to discuss. If you have ridiculed my children who have died, if you have ridiculed my great loss and shown me no pity or sympathy, why in the world should I listen to you? It makes no sense, unless I cared about my friends. I think that's what we see here. Job, in the midst of his pain, is worried about his friends dishonoring God. He seems to be worried about the fact that they are setting themselves up for the judgment of God, and they need to change their thinking to thinking about God and his real power. Somehow I think we see that Job still loves his friends and is thinking about someone other than himself here. I think we as Christians need to remember this in our dealings with others, that even in the midst of our greatest pain, remember that there are others who are more lost, more confused than we are, even if everything's going okay in their lives. But he gives them some great advice. He tells them to hold their peace, to be quiet, quit ridiculing God. There are quite a few quotes that go along with this. Perhaps you've heard the one that it's better to remain silent and be thought of a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt that you are a fool. We've probably heard that one before. Or maybe light travels faster than sound. That is why some people appear bright until you hear them speak. Job's friends obviously don't know what they're talking about. And Job is warning them, stop it. Stop ridiculing my God. And verses 7, he says, Will ye speak wickedly for God and talk deceitfully for him? Will ye accept his person? Will ye contend for God? Is it good that he should search you out? Or as one man mocketh another, do ye so mock him? Job is completely right here. There is nothing he said so far in chapters number 12 and 13 that we've come across so far that is wrong in any way. He is warning his friends that God will hold them accountable for what they say in God's stead. And that's exactly what happens at the end of the book of Job. God does rebuke these men for trying to speak his will when they had no idea what he meant. They presumed to speak for God when they had no right to. So anyway, so far we've seen some impeccable reasoning, and he is definitely not wrong. He also asked his friends to cut him a little slack, as we would say in our society. He says in Job 13:20, Only do not two things unto me, then will I not hide myself from thee. He says, you can stick around, my friends. Just do two things for me. Let's lay some ground rules for how we're going to talk. Unfortunately, his friends don't abide by them. It says in verse number 21, Withdraw thine hand far from me, and let not thy dread make me afraid. He says, let's be polite. That's about what it boils down to. He says, withdraw thine hand far from me. In other words, don't make my suffering worse than it is. Then he goes over and he says, and don't make me afraid by the way you're talking. Don't increase my suffering. Help me through this. Don't make my suffering worse. Sadly, they completely ignore this. We've already gone through what his alternative responses might have been. He could have simply said, you are right, I'm wrong, now just leave me alone. He could have told them to hit the road, but instead he has taken the time to describe where their reasoning is wrong. But he has not really justified himself. He has not taken the time to claim that his righteousness. Instead, he is focused on the fact that God's righteousness, God's reason must be preserved. So in this rather personal attack, even though he's obviously upset, I think we can commend Job for the fact that he's concerned about the character of God and the relationship his friends have with God, rather than his own reputation. But then we go back through and he asserts his faith and his trust in God. This goes into chapter number 13, all the way through chapter number 14. We will not go all the way through. But first of all, he says that he's committed to God. Job 13, 15, and 16, one of the most beautiful verses in the entire book of Job. He says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him." He says, no matter what God chooses, I'm still going to follow God. He concludes by saying, "He also shall be my salvation, for an hypocrite shall not come before him." Job makes it very clear that he doesn't know which way his life is going, whether God will end it, whether God will make him suffer more. He says, "I don't know, but I will serve God. That much I do know." He also says that I do know God's salvation is still there for me. God is still right, even if I don't understand what he's doing today. Talk about some remarkable faith. Considering what the man has gone through, it's truly remarkable he is still in this state of mind. It reminds me, of course, of the 3 Hebrew children in Daniel 3, 17 and 18. Speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, they say, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king." In verse number 18, though, they say, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." They say, whether God delivers us or not, we will still serve, we will still do what's right. I think these are laudable positions for us to try to follow in our lives, that no matter what God chooses in our lives, we must still serve him. Remember to have faith in him even in our darkest hours, because he knows what's best, even when we don't understand. And then he concludes with some fatalistic stoicism. Recently, Stoicism, an old philosophy back from, of course, Greek era, has had a resurgence of beliefs and people who are trying to follow it. It's an interesting doctrine. It's the idea of following after your duty rather than anything else in life. No matter how painful, how unpleasant, always do your duty. Of course, you have to determine what your duty is. It's kind of important for that doctrine. It's the idea that suffering is not exactly bad, it's just part of life. Life is not made for happiness, it's made for doing what's right. And I think that's commendable, even if it's not exactly honest. So let's get into this, and Job is going to describe it for us. He starts by talking off in the temporal nature of life. Job 14, 1 and 2, he says, "Man that is born of a woman is of a few days and full of trouble." That sums up stoicism pretty well. It means you don't have long on this earth and it's going to be miserable, so you better make it count. I'm not saying that's a healthy perspective, even if it is noble. He goes on in verse number 2, and he says, "He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not." I was speaking to a gentleman the other day, and he made the statement, you've probably heard it before, but he said, none of us get out of this alive. There's a lot of truth to that. We're all going to die sometime unless Jesus comes back for us first. So what should our goal be with the time that we have? Job is saying, the time I have is miserable, but I still have a duty to perform in the midst of it. I think we can find that commendable. He goes on and he says, he is hoping for improvement in Job 14, 6 and 9. "Turn from him, that he may rest till he accomplish as an hireling his day." He's wishing, of course, for going home to heaven again. And then verse number 9, he's hoping that before he goes home to heaven, it says, "Yet through the scent of water it will bud and bring forth boughs like a plant." He says, just like when you cut down some plants, you cut them all the way to the ground. But it says some plants won't die even when you cut them down. They will still spring back up with just a scent of water. Job says, that might be my life. I have a little bit of hope for it, but I'm not betting on it, to use the modern vernacular. He says, I'm hoping things will improve, even though I'm not counting on it. Moving on, so we see, of course, the temporal nature of life is hope for improvement, but now he gets into his painfulness of his life. Job 14, 20 through 22. says, Thou prevailest forever against him, and he passeth. Thou changest his countenance, and sendest him away. His sons come to honor, and he knoweth it not, and they are brought low, but he perceiveth it not of them. But his flesh upon him shall have pain, and his soul within him shall mourn. This is speaking, of course, of a man who's passed on, who is not able to see either his children succeed or fail. A very dark passage. But that's kind of where chapter 14 concludes. Job, to his credit, has rebuked his friends, told them where they were wrong and how to fix their thinking. He seems to have a concern for them even in the midst of his pain. We also see that he is incredibly committed to his God even in the midst of his trials. But we do see that he is not exactly perfect in his thinking. Even Job's thinking started to go a little bit awry here. He started to get a little down. Look at his logic here. He says, My life is filled with pain. That is all chapter 14 is made, all that chapter 14 is. And then he concludes by, therefore, all life is pain. Even at the beginning of the chapter, he says, of course, in verse number 1, Man that is born of a woman is a few days. That's true. And full of trouble. Well, that one's kind of hard to prove. Can you prove life is entirely full of trouble? Is that a healthy mindset? Is that the mindset that Christ wants his children to embrace? Not really. It's not the mindset we find in the New Testament by any means. But in spite of the fact that Job is obviously discouraged, that seems to be the point of chapter number 14. He's obviously discouraged by what has happened in his life. He still has not lost his faith or the fact that he still trusts that God will take care of it. I believe in our lives we need to take this as a very strong example for us. Yes, we should be concerned about our friends even in the midst of our problems. Concern for others takes our focus off of our problems. We need to remember to stay committed to God. But let's also remember that just because times are difficult in our life in a particular point of time doesn't mean that it always will be. It doesn't mean that we need to have our joy stolen from us. Now, in Job's life, to be fair, there was not much he could be happy about. It's not like he'd find some escapism in anything in his life, but he did have a God he could rejoice in. Instead of going through chapter number 14 and bemoaning life, he could have gone back in and talked about the power of his God again, as he did in chapter number 12 and 13. That would be a much healthier way for Job to keep his mind instead of chapter number 14. That's not to say we shouldn't be grateful for where he is and the great truths he expounds on, but let us remember that even in the midst of our problems, that even when we don't know what to make of what's going on, let us remember that we have a great God that understands all, and remember that our mind should be stayed upon him no matter what. If you will, please join me in standing. We'll close in a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your goodness and your love to us. Lord, we thank you for the lessons you've taught us, even from Job's somewhat sarcastic rebuttal of his friends. Thank you for the fact that he showed this concern for them. He showed the fact that, yes, life is difficult, but Lord, help us to remember, like him, to stay committed, and help us to also remember to find the joy in your word and in who you are. We thank you for this, Lord. We ask you to please continue to help us to rejoice in who you are. Thank you for giving us a reason to rejoice and a reason to have joy in our lives. We ask this in your Son's precious name. Amen.